Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. This is my first time trying to be the host on Crowdcast. So today is the second day of the Context and Episodic Memory Symposium. I realized that we've been on lockdown for way too long because I found out this morning that I didn't know how to make my tie, so no tie. Anyway, it's great to introduce today's session. We had a wonderful series of presentations and posters yesterday and an amazing talk from Dan Schachter. And today looks to be another wonderful day. So our first speaker will begin in a couple of minutes is going to be Jordan Suchow from Stevens Institute of Technology. And his presentation will be followed by a discussion by Mark Steyvers. To remind you, the format of the long talks is going to be an 18-minute presentation followed by a 10-minute discussion and 7 minutes for Q&A. And we have a wonderful technical team helping me in the background who will make sure that we stay on track. And I guess without further ado, let me welcome Jordan as our first presenter for today's second day of the Context and Episodic Memory Virtual Symposium. Okay, you guys, hopefully Jordan is getting ready to come on stage here. This is an interesting technology that we're all figuring out as we go forward. See, I can't see anybody else, so okay, let me make sure. Okay, good. All right, well, while we wait for Jordan to get up on stage, let me say that next year, I hope we will have an in-person meeting of the Context and Episodic Memory Symposium because I miss seeing all of your friendly faces in person. But here we are, Jordan.
Hello.
Jordan's on stage. Welcome.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
We can, and I think we can now see your screen, which is terrific. So Jordan Suchow will present memory maintenance in a partially observable mind, rationally deciding what to maintain. And take it away, Jordan.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. I thought I'd start with the backstory of this project, which it was inspired by research on the forgetting functions of visual memory. And on the left are forgetting functions in iconic and perhaps working memory, showing the number of items remembered as a function of time. And on each trial, the participant sees a briefly presented array of objects, say shapes or colorful squares, which are then removed and replaced with a blank screen. After some retention interval, a cue appears in the location of one of the objects, and the participant's asked to report either its shape or color. As the retention interval increases, the probability of correctly responding decreases, and there's been lots of work characterizing the functional forms of curves like these. They're typically convex and decreasing. People say they're roughly exponential or power law-like. On the right is a figure reprinted from Zheng and Luck 2009, which characterizes memory representations along two dimensions, their existence and their strength, or specifically the probability of recalling an item and the precision with which it's recalled, given that it actually is recalled. So the red curve plots the probability of failing to recall the tested item as a function of time. So you can think of it as like a linear transformation of a forgetting function, one that's flipped upside down. And the green curve plots the precision of recall as a function of time. And as part of a larger research program on visual working memory representations, they claimed that only one of these properties of visual working memory actually degrades over time. That is the probability of recall, but not precision. And around the time I saw this work, I had been reading about models from population genetics, which tend to have very explicit process models of how populations change over time. And I became frustrated that models of degradation in visual working memory considered only very simple decay processes. And in fact, often the visual working memory models considered time only implicitly, modeling it as a probability of survival at the time of test. And so I saw an opportunity here to translate across the disciplines and create more formal models of degradation in visual working memory. So for example, let's go back to that Zheng and Luck model, which holds that degradation is all or none at the level of entire items or objects, with a single cross-item probability of degradation. The nearest neighbor to this among population genetics models is called a pure death process. So there's items that decay independently of each other across time. And there's a few different ways to represent it, but here what I'm showing you is 5 items which are all present before the first time step, and they're lost over time, going from filled circles to unfilled circles as time proceeds downward. And so I'll use this kind of graphical technique of filled circles being present and unfilled being the kind of death event throughout this, with time proceeding downwards. Okay, so then if you're willing to entertain the idea that items vary not just in presence, but also fidelity, you can generalize this model by presuming that there's some sort of commodity or resource with a many-to-one mapping to items. You might think of it as the representational juice. Some items here, such as the red or the yellow or green item, may receive less of the commodity than other items, such as the purple, the kind of black or orange item. Importantly, an item's lost only once the last bit of the commodity assigned to it is gone, at which point it becomes inaccessible. And importantly, it's units of the commodity here that decay independently of each other and across time. These quanta of the commodity might represent something like cycles of a time-based refreshing process, or something like neural populations in prefrontal cortex representing like token encodings of visual events. So this model provides reasonable fits to forgetting functions, and it tends to take the form of a sum of exponentials. But it misses an important property, which is that the forgetting functions tend to asymptote at 1, not at 0. And then there's this question about what happens to the resource when an item is lost. Here it says it's just no longer contributing to the act of memory maintenance. And one would think that it might be repurposed or used in some way, even if it has become detached from the thing that it's representing. So going one step further, we can incorporate a simple interference or reallocation mechanism where the resource doesn't disappear, but is instead repurposed. And this gives us what in population genetics is called a Moran process. So at each time step, one quantum of the commodity or resource degrades or becomes unbound to the represented item, and it's reassigned to another item. So another way to interpret this is as interference, where the representation of one item actually impedes that of another. So here we have the same kind of degradation event as the open circle, but now there's actually something that's going to replace it, marked by a plus, with time proceeding downwards. And the major thing is that the commodity persists over time. And at the end, you get fixation to a single item as opposed to 0. So fitting this third model to the observed time course of degradation in visual working memory provides like not unreasonable fits to the forgetting functions. And interestingly, the only free parameters here are actually the quantization of the commodity, which is a big topic of debate, and the relevant timescale of a single step, which we should be able to triangulate from other data sources. All that being said, these models of degradation in visual working memory, what they all share is that they're neutral or passive, in the sense that they're not actually under control of the observer, of the maintainer in any way. However, maintenance in visual working memory is active and can actually be brought under conscious control. People are able to voluntarily prioritize what actually gets encoded and maintained. And that's most clearly shown in the directed remembering paradigm. So let's talk about that. In the directed remembering paradigm, participants are asked to remember a set of items, and after some delay, are asked to report a feature of one of the items selected at random. So here they're given 2 colorful squares, and they're asked to report the color of one of them after some delay. critically, in condition 2 prime, they're given 2 items, but actually midway through the retention interval, they're given a valid cue that tells them which of the items will later be tested. And this gives the participant the opportunity to redirect maintenance to the to be remembered item and away from the to be forgotten item. And indeed, they can in fact use the cue and perform better with it than without it. Not quite as well as if there had only been one to start, but better in any case. And so what I'll do here is to actually extend that neutral model, allowing it to be brought under control in order to account for phenomena such as directed or remembering. And the way that I'll do that is to provide the observer with a mechanism by which they can actually control the reallocation and interference. Now, they won't get to decide which quantum of the commodity degrades. We'll just assume that it's a random process not under their control. But they will control the reassignment of the quantum. So they get to decide basically which, in this figure, which of the quanta get the plus sign. On any given step, one of them will degrade, but they get to decide which one is actually going to take its place. So given that control mechanism, we can now do a kind of computational level analysis, asking what are the possible strategies for actually using this control process. And then once we know what are the possible strategies, we can ask, what's the optimal way to use it? And so this requires some sort of framework for thinking about sequential decision making, where here the decision maker is some active maintenance process, deciding what to actually focus maintenance on. And the framework that I'll use here is the Markov decision process. So just to review, an MDP is often defined as this kind of 5-tuple, where SATRD, where S is the state space, A is the set of possible actions, T is a transition model or matrix, R is the reward function, and D is a discount factor. And specifically, at each time step, the agent is going to select an action from the action set, which will then transition the agent into some new state in accordance with the probability distribution defined by the transition model. And having taken that action in transition to that new state, the agent will receive a reward that depends on the action that they took to get to that new state. And they'll receive some reward, and by definition, the agent's goal is to maximize the total reward that's received, with some discount factor D. So the generality of this Markov decision process has made it a pretty effective tool for studying decision-making in a wide variety of domains. It's seen adoption as a normative model of decision-making in disciplines that are concerned with that, like operations research and game theory or AI. And it's also, as many of you are well aware, it's seen adoption as a model of human and animal learning in the context of reinforcement learning, with some of that work having been done by members of our audience. So now, to actually apply the MDP framework to the problem of memory maintenance, we need to actually map each element of the decisioning process. Sorry, I keep hitting that. To some element of our maintenance process of our memory model here. And so now that's what I'll do now. So here, what is a state? A state is actually an allotment of the quanta to items to be remembered. And so any one item might receive the entire commodity or only a portion of it, or perhaps none at all. And so what is the state space? The state space is then it's like a discrete simplex, where it's the space of all possible allotments of those commodities, those quanta to the items. Okay, so that's the state space. And then what is the set of possible actions? Well, the set of possible actions corresponds to the maintenance process selecting one of the quanta to actually choose to replicate, to maintain, and it doesn't actually depend on the state. The transition matrix is defined by the degradation process and maintenance process, which here we're assuming is the Moran process. So at each time step, one of the quanta degrade because another quantum interferes with it or replaces it, and the degraded quantum is chosen randomly, uniformly across all the quanta. And so the interfering or replacing quantum is determined by the action chosen by the maintenance process. Okay, then we have the reward function, and this is going to depend entirely on the objective defined by the task. So the most common reward function that we see in kind of laboratory memory maintenance tasks is a time-varying function that gives participants the full reward if they remember enough about the tested item to actually access it at the time of test, and they get no reward otherwise, though there are plenty of different different memory tasks in the literature, and each of them will have, depending on they'll have some kind of implicit reward function. And then the discount factor is a free parameter, which either you can think about as being a property of the task, or you could think about it as being a property of the observer, but we'll just kind of leave this as a free parameter for now and punt on nailing it down. Okay, so even though this MDP captures the problem of sequential decision-making, it doesn't actually capture the particular strategy that's used by an agent to make a decision. And that strategy is defined by a policy, which is a function that maps an action or probability distribution. It's a function that specifies with an action or a probability distribution over actions for each possible state. And a lot of the research on MDPs, Markov decision processes, focuses on finding the optimal policy, the one that maximizes the possibly time discounted reward. So very simple maintenance policies don't actually depend on the current state and just produce the same behavior in every state. We might call them kind of like unconditional policies. For example, just always, in this case, like always selecting the leftmost quantum, just picking one thing and always saying that's going to be the target of maintenance. Or random, that's also an unconditional policy. But a conditional policy will actually depend on the state. And in the context of memory maintenance, we can consider a strategy like always select one of the quantum that's assigned to a particular item. Luckily, optimization techniques actually make it possible to compute the optimal policy for an MDP exactly. And so our approach here to compute the optimal policy is to use value iteration to compute the optimal policy for a time discounted variant of this MDP under each of the reward functions in the literature. Now, what ends up happening is that the optimal policy, of course, depends quite a lot on the reward structure of the task. And for a lot of the reward structures, the ones that really encourage remembering the tested item, they tend to prefer to maintain memories that are weakly represented. That is because they need to hold everything because any one of them might be tested. They tend to focus on whatever is weakest. So here in this example, they might prefer to maintain the quanta associated with the red item and the purple item and not the orange one. Whereas other tasks encourage just remembering one of any, or like just at least one item, in which case they might prefer to maintain the optimal policy there maintains the more strongly represented items. And so really at a minimum, any implementation of this optimal policy will need to be able to selectively maintain memories according to their strength and according to their identity. The optimal policy is basically, well, actually, it is just by definition the normative solution to the problem. But finding that optimal policy it's possible computationally, but it's intractable, and it's intractable because finding the optimal policy just grows rapidly with the state space, which here is a function of the number of quanta. And so what we did was to implement an approximation to the optimal policy, one that can actually sample quanta by doing probability matching to the number of quanta assigned to a particular item. And that gets us those two key characters of being able to maintain items in proportion to their strength. And then we can also get identity by prioritizing some items over others. And so with those two, we're doing probability matching with also this weighting function over items. We have this like general space of very simple strategies. And so what we do is we build this layer on top of it, a kind of meta policy, which we call loose after the loose choice axiom, which chooses the value of L and F, which here are to what extent do you prefer to maintain strongly represented items or weakly represented items, and F, to what extent do you prefer the yellow, red versus purple. And we actually allow the policy to choose those two parameters according to the task. And so we'll use that as an efficient approximation of the optimal policy. Okay, so
3 minutes. 3 minutes.
Okay, great, thank you. So with that in hand now, the next step is with this approximation to the optimal policy in hand, what we're going to do is we're going to go and see how that actually plays out when we try to reproduce forgetting functions from the literature. So here what we're doing is reproducing forgetting functions in a non-directed task. And what you'll see on the left is this capacity as a function of time. There's the neutral policy, there's the optimal policy, and there's the loose meta policy. And they all produce some features of experimentally measured forgetting functions, including things like load-dependent forgetting and load-dependent rates of forgetting. However, the optimal policy shows really shallow forgetting functions that asymptote at unrealistically good performance, and only the loose and neutral policies show the characteristic fragility under high load. Actually, if you just do a direct head-to-head comparison, there was a kind of time scaling issue in the previous plot where we held time constant. Here, if you actually rescale, you fit the time parameter, you actually see that the loose policy and neutral policy, they're pretty similar in what they can actually capture, differing mostly in curvature and to the extent to which that curvature deepens at greater set sizes. But what's really actually interesting is reproducing the directed remembering effects, simulating performance of a memorizer who actually uses the loose policy in the directed remembering task, in this case from experiment 1 of Williams et al. 2012. And so the one that I actually described when talking about directed remembering. And so here what we're doing is a head-to-head comparison of our random policy, that's the neutral policy, the actual optimal policy, and the loose policy in a head-to-head comparison, comparing it with the behavioral results. And what we see is that like a random policy just can't actually do directed remembering because it's by definition random, and the optimal policy does too well, where you get full-blown directed remembering with no cost whatsoever. You can then also look at the cost of directed remembering, which is, when you direct remembering from maintenance from one item to another, it necessarily means that the one that is to be forgotten, you do worse. And the random policy just doesn't show that behavior at all, whereas the optimal policy and loose actually do that show the cost of directed remembering. This is plotting probability of remembering as a function of each of those conditions, either one item, two item, the to be remembered item being the focus and the to be forgotten one being tested. And then the last thing we looked at is self-directed remembering, and this is where rather than receiving an external cue about which item to focus maintenance on, participants get an internal cue. And what I mean by that is they're asked to actually direct maintenance to the thing that's currently best or worst maintained. And that just isn't on the table for a random policy, but the optimal policy does show that behavior where it can actually tap into this kind of meta-memory capacity, and the loose approximation can do it too, just as people can. And I'll save the last bit of this, which is talking about some kind of limitations of observability and partial observability for the discussion. Great, thanks a lot.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Jordan. So we are now moving into the discussion phase, and Mark Steyvers will be presenting some remarks on Jordan's presentation. And in the meantime, feel free to make notes about your questions that you'd like to ask for after the discussion period. Mark.
Hello.
Welcome back to CEMS. It's great to see you.
Yeah, it's great to be part of the conference. Let's see, how do I share? Oh, here, share the screen. All right, so can everybody see the screen?
We can, yes.
All right, so should I get started or?
Please, go ahead, get started, yes.
All right, so yeah, thanks Jordan for this very insightful presentation. I think it's very nice to see some computational modeling work to this very challenging area of meta memory, of a cognitive system sort of monitoring memory strength and then actually actively intervening to sort of prioritize some memories over others. So Jordan's work focused mostly on working memory tasks, and there is no need to maintain the items after the trial is done. But because my background is in long-term memory, I'll focus mostly on the implication of this kind of modeling approach for long-term memory, where we do need to maintain the items. I think it's useful to think about some conceptual framework developed by Nelson and Ahrens, generally on metacognition. And as far as I can tell, this was never developed into a full-fledged computational model. But I think it's useful to help us think through about some of the issues of metacognition. So on the one hand, we have some cognitive component, like some memory process, that can be monitored by some cognitive control process, a metacognitive component, or there's some meta policy that is monitoring the memory strengths, let's say, of this underlying memory process, and can also send control signals, like selectively strengthening some items over others, as Jordan mentioned. But metacognition can send more complex control signals, like actively seeking out, new information from the environment. And it makes this whole computational framework of metacognition and meta-memory so complicated, because you're actively intervening in your own memory and you're changing the contents of your memory. So one interesting aspect of this Moran process, as far as I can tell, and Jordan, feel free to correct me, is that if there are currently no quanta assigned to an item, in other words, if a memory trace has 0 strength, then the system has no knowledge of that item. It doesn't know that it doesn't know. Whereas in long-term memory, we can be partially aware of our memory gaps. So we're often painfully aware that we can recognize a face, we know this person, but we don't remember the name. So I think it's useful to think about the extensions of this Moran process that have more expressive representations, to take it sort of, let's say, out of computational biology and more firmly into, let's say, the memory domain, where there might be associations between quanta. So perhaps some quanta represent the face of a person, some quanta represent the name of a person, and that could allow for awareness of memory gaps. Also, I'm wondering, sort of any process involving cognitive control, it very quickly gets complicated. And I guess I'm wondering, are there sort of additional constraints that we can put on these models by having stronger empirical paradigms? Can we sort of directly measure the effects of this maintenance policy, as opposed to just modeling, let's say, the successes and failures of memory? So one direction to consider is rehearsal. Maybe we can monitor the overt rehearsal, let's say, that's sometimes done in free and serial recall. When in self-directed learning, you get this new wealth of data on how people make study decisions, how they order their study decisions, how they time it, how much time they allocate to it, and how they space their memories. I think that can put additional constraints on some of these computational models. It's also, I think, interesting to think about some metacognitive limitations. It's certainly true that when people are allowed to self-direct their memory, the finding is that leads to better memory outcomes. When the flow of experience, the learning experience, is under your control, you can better remember things than if you're in a sort of standard memory paradigm where the experimenter controls your experience. And perhaps that's due to a coordination of attention and memory. Maybe you can sort of hold off encoding some information if you're not ready, if you're not in the right attentional state. But it's also known that when people are allowed to self-direct, that doesn't always lead to the most sort of beneficial outcomes. So as memory researchers, we all know about the benefits of spacing, but remarkably, when people are allowed to space, they don't always take advantage of it. So there might be some limitations of metacognition that the system is just not taking opportunities such as spacing. So I'm wondering, does that suggest a challenge for this sort of rational framework of memory? Why can't sort of a memory system be aware of these kinds of opportunities? Or maybe we can turn this around. Maybe this is exactly something that can be predicted from a resource rational framework. Maybe it's just too complicated to plan all these things. Maybe if you run the Markov decision process, on limited resources, maybe that would exactly lead to some of these ineffective study strategies. Let's see. I think I'll end on this last slide. One of the advantages of thinking about rational models is that, following in the work of John Anderson, you can think of sort of the natural environments. So what are the natural statistics that we've been exposed to and that we've adapted to, and that led to these optimal policies? And I'm wondering, some of these paradigms, they seem great as lab paradigms. I'm wondering, are they so natural for these rational models? The directed remembering paradigm seems a little awkward to me. Where do these external cues come from that tell us what we should or should not remember? And generally, the question is, where do these policies come from? How can they be learned? So in the paper that Jordan and his colleague Tom Griffith is writing, it's a very nice paper. They talk about sort of potential reinforcement learning strategies to learn these policies. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that wonderful discussion. And so now we have an opportunity for some Q&A. I wanted to first give Jordan an opportunity to react to the discussant's comments, and then I want to invite some of our questioners on stage.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Mark. I thought that was really insightful. I think there are a few there's a few of your points I think struck me. One of them is there's a sense in which the maintenance model here is content free. That is, the model that I was proposing here, all it cares about, all it has access to, is to what extent is that item, that event strongly represented, but it's got none of the actual content of that event. And you saw that I think there's a lot of opportunity there to make both more naturalistic models and one that build on the expertise of this community in building models that actually explicitly take into account content-based associations between items. Part of the reason why it's so contentless in that sense is exactly what you said, which is that, at least in the visual working memory literature, quite over short time scales, quite a lot of it has, I was struck by Ida's model space yesterday, where it's very strongly like in praise of artifice, where the tasks are extremely abstracted. People bring to the table rich associations with colors and shapes, but we kind of throw those away and say, just remember the color of a square. Also, many of the tasks are you can use this word not in the way that is used in this community, but very episodic, in the sense that you start a trial, you remember some items, you finish the trial by responding in some way, and then we throw it all away, and anything else we just call it interference across trials, and it's a thing that we want to try to filter out in our analysis, or maybe study it as a separate phenomena. But that's quite distinct from how much of our lives occur, where new things happen all the time, and we sit there with the same memory system and are constantly asked, what do we want to replace and what we're actively holding in mind, and we don't get the benefit of, unless we're participant in one of these studies, of being able to focus all of our time and attention to just a particular memory task. The last thing I want to talk about, or just the last kind of response, is about observability and meta memory, where the MDP model makes a very strong assumption about the observability of the state of memory. It says that it's fully observable. People know exactly the assignment of those quanta to items, and that seems pretty unrealistic for all the reasons that meta memory isn't perfect. It would also need to update extremely quickly to keep up with what is, I imagine, a very active maintenance process. And so one way to extend the modeling framework to account for observability is through the partially observable Markov decision process. And there what you do is you say, basically, rather than having full observability, you have partial observability. You have a very specific model of, like, a sensor model, which in this case is a formal model of meta memory. To what extent can people people observe the state. The big issue is that then the solution to it is even more intractable. And so there's a whole line there of asking, okay, given that we have only partial observability into our memories, what does it even look like to have an efficient strategy that makes use of that information in order to decide what to maintain when we don't even know what state we're in, but maybe there's kind of sample-based approximations that might help there. Okay.
Okay. I'd like to invite Chang. Hi, Chang. Can you hear me? So Chang Zhang has a question. I wanted to invite her to ask that. I don't think we can hear Chang. Maybe Connor can help. Okay. I think her microphone is off. Your microphone is off, Chang. I don't know if we can fix that. Okay. If not, I will read your question. So Chang asks, really cool model. She's wondering if there's a cost or a limit to how much cognitive control can be exerted if without the loose rule. Current model seems to predict that the longer the time duration of the maintenance period, the better the memory will be, since there is more opportunity to direct maintenance to more rewarded memories over time. So,
yeah. So, this is I like this question. Basically, I think the answer to it is all hidden in what the word better means. So it's not the case that the model would say that if you direct maintenance to something, it's going to improve over time, or direct more time, it's going to improve over time in the sense that you're going to have some information content about the memory that you didn't have at the beginning of the maintenance. What it says is that it'll be better in the sense of less bad. That is, a sustained maintenance of an item will produce a better result than less maintenance of the same item, but not better than you would had you just asked them about it earlier. And the way to see that in the Moran process, at least, is that you can gain quanta assigned to a particular item, and so in that sense, you might have a stronger memory. But then this goes back to why it's contentless, right? What we really need is some model of the information content. What do the quanta actually hold? What do they store? Because then what we would see is that really they're all just copies of each other. So I'm most familiar with thinking about this in the context of population genetics, where you, like in the Moran model, you start with a population, you might have many different genes represented, but the end result as you play it forward in time is that one of the quanta reaches fixation. Basically, the entire population is just copies of whatever that is. In the memory context, that's basically saying that the prediction of this is that in the long run of working memory maintenance, all you're left with is one really robust but not precise memory of a single item. And that's because what you end up with is all quanta assigned to that particular item, but they are all just these kind of like degraded copies of one of the units of the commodity from the start.
Great. I think I want to call upon our next question from Gordon Logan. Gordon, are you coming online? I could read the questions, but I want to see my friends on stage. So there we go. Wait, there's Gordon. Hi, Gordon.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you great.
Good.
Go ahead.
So I thought this is really interesting. It's my first exposure to these ideas, and I think it's very cool. I'm wondering about the load on executive processing you're placing here, that it seems that you have to make a decision. You require kind of a meta-memory decision on each time step in the model. But the time steps in these visual short-term memory experiments, I mean, the time course is really relatively short. and decisions take 200 to 1,000 milliseconds. And so I'm wondering if it's really plausible there. And I like Mark's discussion of this as a solution, that it applies to longer time scale. It may have a better application and it may be more tractable at longer time scales. But I wondered what you thought about the executive load, the load you're putting on the poor executive.
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and there's kind of two ways to go. One of them is to ask, like, what do we actually mean by decision, and to what extent is it actually like a conscious, deliberate choice, versus using the word decision as kind of like just the action. The process by which an action is chosen under the hood. So in the case of something like visual working memory maintenance, I kind of see this as kind of like breathing, where there's this kind of default operation, and I can imagine this process happening every 10 milliseconds for a time step, but that there is one can step in and decide to breathe. One can step in and decide to redirect maintenance, controlling kind of like turning the car, or turning, I don't know what the right metaphor for this is, but it's like I kind of imagine this Moran process as it's like keeping up all the balloons, and it's like you can direct it in some ways so that you prioritize some or the other, kind of shifting the balance of this maintenance. So that's one way to go, to say that, oh, most of this is happening under the hood. It's not conscious, deliberate decisions. The other one is to actually think about areas like long-term memory, I think, where you basically push on the time scale so that there actually is the opportunity where you could kind of model this as people are making a handful of decisions on a medium term time scale. So I don't have any great answer. I think it really needs it needs like a step towards on the visual working memory side, it requires a step towards thinking about what is the actual neural implementation of a maintenance process, and that will constrain the relevant time scale into what a decision is.
I want to get a final word from Mark. You get the last word here.
Oh my goodness. I think this is really exciting. So, well, this is my subjective impression of the field, that executive processes, cognitive control, it's one of the hardest areas to do computational modeling, and we need to have multiple perspectives. So the resource rational approach is a welcome entry into this field. So yeah, I hope we see more of your work.
Great. Okay. Wonderful discussion. And I think it's time for us to move on to the next presentation. I'll just add to the commentary that I think the fusion of decision-making, memory, and cognition is an exciting direction where the field is clearly moving. And so on that note, I want to bring on stage our next presentation by Samantha Audrain from the University of Toronto. Welcome, Samantha. It's great to have you here at CEMS, and we look forward to your presentation. Prior knowledge accelerates neocortical integration at the expense of episodic detail. Sounds fascinating. Take it away.
Thank you. And I'm assuming you guys can all see my screen. So yeah, thanks to all the organizers. This has been really great. It's my first CEMS, and it's been really interesting so far. I'm just finishing up my PhD at the University of Toronto with Mary Pat McAndrews. And I'm really interested in this process of systems consolidation. And this is how we think this works on a basic level. So we know that the hippocampus is initially required to encode and retrieve episodic memories, but that over time, the neocortical memory trace is strengthened such that a version of the memory can be retrieved without the hippocampus. And I think that there's a growing consensus that with cortical consolidation, quality of memory becomes coarser and less precise, although we think the hippocampus continues to support detailed episodic memory retrieval. And for a long time, we considered systems consolidation to be a slow process unfolding over days to even years. But more recently, we've come to appreciate the impact of already consolidated information on new incoming content. And that's because it's been shown that in rodents, prior knowledge accelerates consolidation in terms of faster independence of the memory trace from the hippocampus. And prelimbic regions like medial prefrontal cortex homologs are important for this effect. And accelerated consolidation hasn't been directly observed in humans, but we have known for a long time that information that's consistent with prior knowledge is better retained, and further that hippocampal-mPFC interaction is important for that prior knowledge benefit. But while we know these regions are important, we don't really understand how prior knowledge acts to accelerate consolidation. And one idea is that it has to do with how overlapping information is represented in the brain. So this study found that multivoxel patterns for objects that had been paired with the same scene during encoding, so this overlapping condition here, became more similar in the mPFC over time relative to non-overlapping items. And these are arbitrary object scene pairs. They didn't see the same degree of integration happening in the hippocampus. And the idea that they put forth about this is that it has to do with how commonalities across experiences come to be represented in the brain. So here we have 3 items that share the same context, which is the jungle, represented by the green nodes here. And the idea is that overlapping representations become strengthened over time in the medial prefrontal cortex, and those unique features fall away, and that's leaving coarser and more similar looking representations here. While if memory remains detailed, then the hippocampus should maintain these distinct memory traces. What we wanted to know is, what if you learn something new that already has strong links to pre-existing schematic representations? So in this case, you might already know that orangutans live in jungles. Does that pre-existing layer of overlap ensure that congruent information is represented more coarsely and maybe integrated into the neocortex faster compared to incongruent information, which has less overlap to begin with? And so we scanned healthy young adults while they're doing the following task. They saw various objects paired with one of 4 different scenes. 2 of these scenes were beaches and 2 were kitchens. And they didn't see the names of the scenes during encoding, but they did learn them beforehand. And half of these objects were semantically congruent or related to the background scene, like a seahorse and a beach, and half were unrelated or incongruent, like oven mitts and a beach. And the task was to indicate if they were related or not during encoding. And at retrieval, they saw just the scene and they had to imagine, or sorry, just the object, and they had to imagine the scene that was associated with that object in as much detail as possible. And then we asked them, what context was that object paired with? Was it with the beach or the kitchen, or do you not know? And then based on their response, we asked them which specific scene. So which beach? Was it the small beach or the big beach, or do you not know? And so this is our way of getting at quality of memory, where we consider coarse memories to be cases where they remember the context, they know it was paired with the beach, but they're not sure which one. And a detailed memory is when they do know exactly which beach that object was paired with. And so they completed this task twice across 3 days. One was a short delay of 10 minutes and a long delay of 3 days. We also had baseline resting state scan and post-encoding resting state scan after encoding for that long delay. And we were particularly interested in the role of the mPFC in the hippocampus, given everything I just outlined. But just to say that we broke the hippocampus ROI down into anterior and posterior segments because we care about quality of memory, which I'll talk a bit more about. But basically, the posterior hippocampus we think is involved in retrieval of really detailed, fine-grained episodic memories. And the anterior hippocampus we think is involved in more global features of those specific memories. Okay, so is congruent content remembered more coarsely over time? We were interested in examining change in quality of memory because we think that memories that rely on the neocortex are qualitatively coarser and less precise than hippocampal memories. And we did find that congruent memories were better retained over time than incongruent. And when we broke these memories down into quality of memory, we saw that while detailed memories were forgotten in both conditions, it was only in the congruent condition where memories became coarser over time. So these light blue bars here. So they're remembering that the object had been paired with the beach, but they're forgetting which specific beach. And so this indicates a shift in quality of memory that's specific to that congruent condition. Next, we want to know, does post-encoding hippocampal-mPFC coupling predict qualitative change in memory? And that's because post-encoding change in connectivity is being considered as a kind of index of early systems consolidation. And given that interaction between these regions is thought to be important for schema-congruent consolidation, you might expect that post-encoding coupling would be important and would track with that change in quality of memory. So we computed the change in functional connectivity between the anterior hippocampus and the mPFC after encoding relative to baseline rest. And we found that that there was having greater post-encoding coupling between these regions was associated with coarser or less precise memories in that congruent condition 3 days later. And there was no relationship between detailed congruent memories and connectivity or incongruent detailed or coarse memories. So it was specific to this, this memory condition, which was interesting. So it was only congruent memories that were becoming coarser over time, which was associated with that post-encoding coupling. Are congruent pairs more integrated in the mPFC over time? And by integrated, I mean, is there more representational overlap for congruent pairs than incongruent, as we hypothesized at the beginning? So what we did is, in the congruent condition, we extracted the pattern of voxels as subjects were remembering the context that the object had been paired with in the mPFC. And we correlated them with all the other congruent objects that have been paired with the same context. So regardless of quality of memory or the specific scene that it was paired with. And in the incongruent condition, we did the same thing, except the objects were incongruent with their shared context. And I'm showing you beach correlations here, but we did do the same thing for kitchens. And we hypothesized that we should see greater similarity in the mPFC for the congruent condition than the incongruent condition, reflecting greater integration of these congruent pairs over time. And that is what we found. So there was an increase in similarity for the congruent information and the incongruent information over time, but more so in the congruent condition. So there's greater representational overlap during retrieval of congruent content 3 days later relative to incongruent. Finally, we wanted to know, are detailed memories represented with specificity in the hippocampus over time? And that's because, according to modern theories, detailed memories are always required, they always require the hippocampus for retrieval. And so we ran a kind of similar analysis where we extracted the pattern in the hippocampus of subjects were remembering the specific scene that an object had been paired with. So this is just detailed memories now. So they are actually remembering that specific scene. And we correlated it with the pattern for all other objects that had been paired with the exact same scene, the similar scene of the same context, so the other beach, and the other context altogether, so kitchens. And I'm showing you congruent correlations here, but we did the same thing for incongruent. And we thought that given evidence that the posterior hippocampus represents fine-grained details, we should see greater pattern similarity for same scene correlations than similar scene or other correlations, because we think the posterior hippocampus should be distinguishing between specific beaches, for example. And we thought that the anterior hippocampus might represent more global features of specific episodes. So we thought it might not distinguish between beaches, for example, but it should represent something about the context. So beaches versus kitchens. And we thought we would see these patterns at both delays, and regardless of congruency, if the hippocampus is truly important for retrieving these kinds of detailed episodic memories, regardless of these factors. And we did find that there was no interaction between scene granularity and congruency. So there's actually no effective congruency here. So I've collapsed across congruent and incongruent just to make it simpler. What we found is that our prediction in the posterior hippocampus was present, but it was only over time. So at the short delay, representations for objects that have been paired with the same scene were no more similar to each other than to those paired with any other scene. But over time, you can see that the posterior hippocampus was distinguishing between similar beaches, for example.
Stand 1 minute.
Okay, thanks. In the anterior hippocampus, again, we see there wasn't much happening at the short delay, but that over time, while it wasn't kind of differentiating between similar beaches, it was representing some degree of context information. So these kind of patterns at the long delay were in line with what we had predicted, but this development over time was not what we expected. And we think it's kind of interesting because it looks like there's some degree of change within the hippocampus itself that's happening over time that's kind of simultaneously integrating overlapping information while keeping it separate from similar experiences. And so just to conclude, we found that information that's congruent with prior knowledge loses precision over time, and that was associated with post-encoding coupling between that anterior hippocampus and mPFC. The congruent information was also represented more similarly over time in the mPFC. And the fact that we didn't see these things in the incongruent condition, we think is in line with this idea of accelerated consolidation. But at the very least, we think it suggests this type of information is treated quite differently in the brain. And we also found that representational specificity emerges over time in the hippocampus for those detailed memories, regardless of congruency, which is kind of our unexpected finding there. And so just to say thank you to my lab members and collaborators and sources of funding, and you guys. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, we have a minute for questions. If anybody wants to either step up or message a question. If not, I will ask a quick question, which, here we have some questions. Good, excellent. Okay, let's see. I'm going to read the question at the top. Is it possible that the shift toward coarse memory for the congruent pairs is a result of different strategies that participants are using for encoding? E.g., for the incongruent pairs, participants rely more on perceptual features to encode the pair and therefore retain more detail. White snow cat with white kitchen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible because, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that even though the contexts are matched, especially in the RSA analysis, that we're only really seeing this pattern emerge. Wait, I don't think I actually showed you this, but we did run some, hang on, let me go with this. So yeah, I don't really know, to be honest. I think that it's totally possible, yeah, and that maybe we could look at this in the future, yeah.
Great, and then we have a question from Ida Mamenejad. Ida, do you want to come on stage, or should I read your question? Well, I'll read your question. Was the hippocampal long delay results mediated by PFC hippocampal connectivity earlier on at encoding? From Ida Mamenejad.
Oh, yeah, no, that was kind of interesting. The connectivity wasn't related to the pattern similarity later on. No, thank you.
Great, thanks, Ida. Okay, well, Sam, thank you again for a great presentation, and we'll go on to the next talk now. Lots of interesting questions I'm sure we have that we can save for informal interactions during the break, which will happen after our last speaker of this session. That is Neal Morton. Neal, welcome on stage. Neal. Neal is from UT Austin, postdoc in Ali Preston's lab, and I think Neal will be up in a moment. I can't wait to see him. I haven't seen him in a while. So, Neal, hello there.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see everybody.
It's good to see you. It's very good to see you. I was recently reminded of found some old documents that you worked on way back when I had the fortune of working with you at Penn. Okay, so Neal is going to be giving a talk on representations of, new title, medial temporal lobe and frontoparietal cortex represent the common structure across events and support abstract inference. So Neal and Meg and Ali, Neal, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So I'm interested in not only how people learn about individual events, but also how they learn about structure that's common across different events. So for example, if you go out to eat in a restaurant, you might first get an appetizer followed by a main course and then a dessert. And then later in another episode, you might go to a different restaurant and get an appetizer followed by a main course. And then still another time, you might go back to that same restaurant you went to before, have the same main course followed by a dessert. So you could store all of this information as individual isolated episodes, but there's, given all of the rich structure that's present within these episodes, there might be a more efficient way of organizing it in terms of that common structure. So, which might look something like this. So you could have an abstract dimension in order to arrange these different events, recognizing the fact that they share this common structure of appetizer, main course, and dessert. And then at the same time, within this cognitive map, you could also have a dimension that's distinguishing different episodes. So we think this might be a particularly efficient way to represent events. So for example, if you remember that you had this appetizer at the second restaurant, if you have an organized cognitive map, that might allow you to prompt for associated events. So for example, queuing for the dessert that you had. Now, you never saw these two dishes together in the same episode, but if they're organized within the same cognitive map, that might make it easier to remember that this dessert was presented at the same restaurant as this other appetizer. So how does the brain actually organize memories with common structure, and do we see this sort of multidimensional organization? So to answer this question, we looked at data from a study by Meg Schlichting and colleagues, where participants studied pairs of items. So first they studied an initial set of A-B pairs, and then later on they were presented with a set of overlapping B-C pairs which shared an associate in common with one of those previous pairs. Participants were instructed about this overlap. They were just instructed to learn individual pairs. Before the study phase, participants were scanned so that we could measure representations of individual objects, and then again afterwards, which allowed measuring how object representations were changing as a result of the learning phase. So if you look at the structure across this entire task, there's sort of two dimensions we can look at. One is the separate triads of A, B, and C items, and the other is this organization of A, B items which are presented first, and then these overlapping B, C pairs which are presented second. And participants see the same structure across 12 different triads. So at the end of learning and after scanning, participants were asked to perform a direct test, so taking a C item and queuing to select the correct B item, for example. And then they're also tested on inferences. So for example, taking a given C item and having to select the indirectly related A item. So importantly, they never actually seen these two items together, but they can infer that they were associated given that they shared a common B item associate. So given the data that we have after the study phase, we can try to look at how is this abstract structure of memories represented in the brain. So to do this, we can look at the individual object representations, the pattern of brain activity observed during presentation of each of these objects. And so here, this is looking at a simple 2 dimensions of 2 voxels here, and look at what the pattern is of each item relative to one another. So we can label these by their role within the task. So here, items in different triads are colored in different ways, and then they're also labeled by their role within that triad of A, B, or C. So during the task, participant learned these individual associations between A, B, B, C, and then can infer indirect AC association. So we predict that before learning, though, these item representations will be sort of scattered. What we predicted was that as a result of learning, there'd be sort of a realignment of these items across different triads, such that the common structure across triads will be reflected in one dimension, and then another dimension will reflect differences between triads. So we got this idea from recent work in non-human primates and more recently in humans, suggesting that neural representations may code relevant dimensions as consistent geometric relationships, which can then be very helpful for representing multiple dimensions in a given representation. So for the purposes of this study, we'll focus on the A and C items within each triad, which we're particularly interested in because they're only indirectly associated with one another. So for example, if we look at one triad, we can simply draw a vector from the A item to the corresponding C item. We can then apply that to a different triad, just add that vector to the corresponding A item to develop a prediction for where the corresponding C item should be. And then we can test how good that prediction actually is. So if this error between actual and predicted is relatively small due to chance, compared to chance, we'll take that as evidence that there's a parallel structure between these different triads. So when we looked at this using a searchlight analysis across the brain, taking within individual local spheres, taking patterns of activation, which we can measure for each individual item, and then to compute a vector direction within this neural space, we can simply take the C pattern and then subtract the corresponding A pattern to get an estimate of what's the direction from A to C within this neural space. We can then take that vector direction and then add it to an A item from a different triad to develop a predicted pattern for that item, and then we can compare that to the one we actually observed. And so we tested to see, is this difference lower than we would expect to the chance, which is estimated by randomly swapping A and C items within triad. So first of all, we predicted that abstract relationships will be represented in hippocampus and medial prefrontal cortex. So prior work has demonstrated that hippocampus and medial PFC are involved in integrating information across experiences, experiences that are sort of indirectly related. Here we tested whether they're actually aligned across experiences that are not associated at all, but really just share a common structure. So we found evidence for this sort of parallel structure within anterior hippocampus and also medial prefrontal cortex, consistent with our predictions. We also found evidence for other areas in frontoparietal cortex, which also are sensitive to this common structure. So these frontoparietal areas have previously been implicated in higher order cognitive control, but this just here is that they may also be recruited in this task, where the only task is really just to learn individual pairs. But nevertheless, they're extracting this common structure across different episodes. So if we look within individual actual brain patterns, we can measure the kind of activity for individual items and use multidimensional scaling to visualize it in 2 dimensions. So here's an example of one participant with particularly strong organization across triads. Here this is colored by whether each item was A or C, and then symbols indicate different triads. So what you can see is across different triads, there's a consistent organization. In contrast, other participants didn't have a consistent organization, and here's an example of someone where their hippocampal patterns didn't distinguish between A and C items. What we also found is that within parahippocampal cortex, we'll also check to see is there a separation between individual triads. So not only was it coding this abstract dimension across triads, but also distinguishing individual triads. We found that this was the case within parahippocampal cortex. So if you label the different triads as just connecting them, you can kind of see that within this space, there's a tendency for individual triads to be separated out at the same time that there's also this abstract dimension. So we think this might be a particularly useful representation to facilitate targeting of specific memories. So given a given C item Q, for example, if you have a vector that can allow you to target the corresponding A item, then that could help you target that specific target and not a corresponding lure. So we predicted that consistent representational geometry would facilitate inference. So looking at this, we contrasted 2 potential mechanisms for retrieval that might be relevant for this task. So one is pattern completion, where a C item Q could be used to retrieve the associated BC pair, which could then be used to select the correct B item in the test. We contrasted this with a vector-based retrieval process, where rather than chaining through individual associations, you might be able to target a specific memory just by its position within this cognitive map. So these 2 processes might be particularly different when you compare direct and inference tests. So inference tests, even though A and C are never seen together, you could still retrieve that association using pattern completion, but it will require multiple retrievals. Whereas if you have a well-organized cognitive map that you can use to target retrieval, this would not have to vary in speed between the direct and inference tests. So we predict that this process would be fixed speed, whereas pattern completion would be a variable speed process. So we modeled these 2 processes using a got it. So we tested these processes using a linear ballistic accumulator model. So this assumed 2 different processes that could drive responses. One, a pattern completion process, which is slower for inference test, and 2, a vector-based process, which is the same speed for both. And so we used we fit the model to individual participant reaction time data to get a measure of how fast each of these 2 processes was. So what we found is that organization within the hippocampus was correlated with the speed of this pattern completion-like process, which was variable in speed, whereas lateral parietal and parahippocampal organization predicted the speed of a vector-based retrieval process. So hippocampus, parahippocampal cortex, and lateral parietal cortex organize experiences with similar properties, even though they're not explicitly cued as part of the task. And representational geometry in hippocampus predicts the speed of pattern completion of individual associations. Whereas we found evidence that there might be a separate mechanism for cueing items from cognitive maps supported by parahippocampal cortex and lateral parietal cortex. So thanks to my collaborators and everyone in the Preston Lab, and happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Neal. So we have a question, Anna Shapiro. Anna says, very exciting work. What do you think the abstract structure represents? The order of presentation? I'm wondering if it's possible that you're picking up on basically a recency effect. If so, could that recency effect be univariate? No need to univariate.
Yeah, great question. So an important thing about this task is there were actually, I didn't mention, but there is actually two very different training conditions here. So in one, all of the AB pairs are learned before any of the BC pairs are seen. In another one, there's an interleave presentation, which is more of a statistical thing where AB is presented and then tends to be followed relatively quickly by a BC pair. And then there's a larger gap between them. And the really interesting thing we see here is that there's similar amounts of organization in both these conditions, even though they're really different training conditions. So I think in one case, in just the block condition, you might think of this as sort of a recency effect, but that can't explain what we see in the interleave condition, which seems to be, I think, more of a temporal statistical learning that's kind of aggregated over time throughout that period.
Great. Neal, a quick question just for me. So when subjects are learning AB, do you think that, I'm sorry, when they're learning BC, do you think that they're sometimes thinking back to A, and do they have a sense that they might need to remember the A item during BC learning? I guess I'm trying to figure out how much of this is happening, how much of what we see about inference is a result of what happens during BC learning versus fully inference taken at retrieval.
Yeah, so I think that's to some extent what's happening during the learning phase is sort of an open question, but I think something like that is happening where during the BC phase, we know that there tends to be reactivation during these overlapping encoding phases. So that might be an opportunity for the sort of reorganization of memories to start happening. I think the AB memories may sort of an anchor, and then the BC memories might be stored relative to that. So that's kind of our working hypothesis.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna let us have one last question. This is Brendan Combs Sheehy asks, thanks for sharing this great work. Classic behavioral work, Bauer, Thorndike, others suggest that similar structures of events can facilitate encoding subsequent events with the same structure. Do you think there's some kind of activation-based facilitation that could explain the pattern similarity findings?
Activation-based
facilitation.
Right. So I guess there's a question of sort of, is this something that's happening kind of at the level of individual triads that they tend to be organized together? Or is there more sort of a matching of sort of the larger structure that's already exists between different pairs? So I think that's an important question to ask, using like more of a transfer structure to see, what if we learn new pairs of the same structure? Can we actually see that being reactivated? So I think there likely is sort of a template that these things would be matched across, and having a transfer learning could help to understand that better.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to stop here. It's time for a break. Let's thank our speakers. And I wanted to make a quick announcement that there will be a town virtual social tonight at the end of the day, and information on the CEMS 2020 social events Google Doc for that activity. Unfortunately, I missed that activity last night, but I hope to be there tonight. And I hope that everybody is aware of this information. So hopefully we'll have a great experience using the town virtual meeting. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you, everyone. We will reconvene at in about, should we say, okay, I think we should give people 15 minutes. So we'll start. We will start at 2 o'clock instead of 1:55. 2 o'clock instead of 1:55, and we'll see you then.